and the event that it is certain is January 1, 2008. January 1, 2008 is a very interesting day because it is on January 1st, 2008 when a very large group of very smart people decided that the international banking and securities and risk transfer markets all need to be able to correspond with one another in fair and equitable and transparent manners. And on January 1st, 2008, Basel II becomes the law of the globe. Some of you don't know what Basel II is, so what I'm going to do is take us back in time and think about what Basel II was supposed to address. Some of us will recall periods of time in our own banking system where we haven't had necessarily full and candid disclosure of how liquid reserves are that back credit obligations and debt extension and securities extension. And so out of that, we actually evolved things like the 1933 Securities Act as amended, the Banking Reform Acts that most recently took place in 2000. We actually amended our own laws, and at the same time, the world decided to get together and say, well, we really need to have a unified way to report transparency in financial institutions. And specifically, we need to understand three fundamentals of how banks work. One is internal process controls, the ability to know that what you're doing is standardized and reproducible, and think OCC in the US, think FDIC rules, think Fed rules, and you've got the picture. But you also have to look at your own internal processes as a bank and understand that you understand how far you can extend credit, how far you can extend treasury management into non-traditional securities, after which you've jeopardized the stability of your credit infrastructure. And it turns out that everybody in a series of conferences that happened to start in Basel wound up agreeing to what was then Basel I. And before Basel I could be promulgated, they realized that a lot of what they put in Basel I didn't cover everything, so they came up with Basel II. And after 7.5 significant meetings and probably thousands of insignificant meetings, Basel I and Basel II now stand as this wonderful moment on the horizon where all financial institutions need to report how on earth they actually measure and quantify the financial risks that they take on. Okay, that's what Basel I and Basel II is. Now, what makes Basel I and Basel II fascinating is that, as with many other international entities and enterprises, there are wonderful sets of proposed rules and regulations and so forth and so on, but all of them are undefined mandates. Thou shalt, but we can't tell you how you do it, so go figure it out. One of the things that I find very delightful about it is one of the things that you have to do is you have to test all of the collateral adequacy you have in your lending environment. Now, for those of you not overly involved in the banking industry, that's actually a very interesting question, because when you actually take out credit as a consumer or as a business, you are supposed to offer up some form of collateral as a secondary source of repayment if you, in fact, become insolvent. That's actually kind of how it works. Now, the problem with that is that we live in a world which, according to the Standard & Poor's study of 1998, suggests that somewhere around 1993, our economy cut loose of tangible assets as the primary denominator of value. In 1993. That, by most people's account, was when we entered the knowledge economy, when balance sheets no longer reflected value. That's when we started getting into the wacky world of price-to-earnings ratios that were 5,000 or 38 or 72, or you pick the number because it doesn't matter because none of the numbers are right, because we don't have any way to measure it. So it's, oh my goodness, doesn't it sound like 1815 again? Where was the value? How can you lose 86% of a market cap from an entire country's market in one day? That's right, you can lose it because the value isn't on the balance sheet. It is not the tangible assets. It is not the cash held in reserves. It's not. Oh, but I digress. That was 1815. That wouldn't happen now. I'm telling you why it can't happen now. That's what I just had to get my mind back on track because I was almost back in 1815 there for a minute. So what you have is a world that in 1993 said that we no longer have tangible balance sheet value that can be quantified and that can be recognized as a basis for commercial transactions in the financial sector, particularly in the banking sector. And over a period of time from 1993 until 1998, it became increasingly evident that that absence of transparency was creating significant problems. Some of us can recall little events like the Japanese banking collapse of 1998. We can recall little events like little disruptions in the financial institutional practices of Russia and Argentina and a few other places. And this can't happen, remember? This can't happen here. We've got it all covered, don't worry. Because on January 1st, 2008, we've got rules that say it will never happen here. And because we have those rules, we have great confidence in the fact that on January 1st, 2008, when we have this wonderful promulgation of rules that come into place and we know capital adequacy will be reported, and it will be reported accurately, and it will be reported consistently, and the FDIC and the OCC just released a report yesterday saying not a single bank on the planet is on track to be compliant with Basel I and Basel II on January 1st, 2008. But that's okay, don't worry, because it can't happen. And the reason it can't happen is because if we don't like rules, we'll change them. And that's the good thing about the knowledge economy, is you can set up all these rules, and you can set up all these accounting things, and you can set up all these things, and if it doesn't quite work out right, change them. Now, just to show you how close we are to 1815, but to highlight the distinction between 1815 and 2008, I want to give you a distinction that took place just a few short years ago. Because actually, a few years ago, we were dangerously close to being more like 1815 than we are to 2008. And that was when we decided to eliminate pooling of interest accounting. Now, some of you will remember that if we eliminated pooling of interest accounting, the market would cease to exist. John Chambers reported that in a Senate Banking Committee roundtable hearing with the CEOs of Medtronic and the CEOs of a couple other corporations, and all of the engine that drove the economy, all the innovation engine of the knowledge economy, would come to a screeching halt if we got rid of pooling of interest accounting. Now, what was pooling of interest accounting? It was a way to do a very interesting thing. To pay anything you wanted for something, tell your shareholders, no, trust me, it's really worth it, and then have the ability to kind of fritter it away. When you needed a loss here, when you needed a gain here, you could kind of play around with it. But you had this giant slush fund, which was really convenient, that you could use whenever you wanted to, and all of a sudden revenue smoothing was, well, I shouldn't say that. Nobody actually did that. People like me could corrupt the intent of people to suggest that maybe what they were doing was falsifying their reporting processes. That didn't really happen. I'm just speculating what an evil, sinister person might have done had they had the opportunity to do that, but it didn't really happen much. Well, okay, we didn't see it, so it didn't really happen much, I think. It may have happened at Waterloo, but it didn't happen here. So, pooling of interest accounting. We take that away, and the world's going to blow up. So what the FASB did was the FASB said, we're going to promulgate rules that say that you have to report the value of the things that you buy, and you have to tell somebody in a financial disclosure that you paid X, and it was worth X, and that's why you bought it for X. Well, didn't quite work out that way. So the rules were promulgated in the next year, and this is really cool. We have some interesting linguistic genomics technology that we can apply to financial reporting. And we could actually, without looking into a document, we could tell you whose accounting firm had actually prepared the financial statements going into the year that FASB 141 and 142 were promulgated. And we could do that by looking at the number of footnote under the financial statement, which essentially said the following. The Financial Accounting Standards Board of the United States has promulgated Rules 141 and 142 that tell us that we have to report to you the true value of the things that we bought. We have no clue how to report to you the true value of those things, and as such, we reserve the right to restate our financials. That's what the footnote said. Apparently, the FASB didn't mean that when they said it was a rule. They didn't mean put in your financial statement that you don't know how to follow the rule. They meant follow the rule. Silly how they were old-fashioned that way. And so the next year, you had about half of the reporting companies saying, and I quote the following, "We have tested all of our intangibles for impairment and have found none." I'd like to walk you into a case study to show you how wonderfully transparent and accountable that was. There's a company called the Caterpillar Corporation. Caterpillar Corporation is not a little bug. It's the big giant things that roll down and plow out highways and build walls in Israel and do cool things like that. The Caterpillar Corporation. Now, the Caterpillar Corporation actually had an enormous amount of technology that they found to be no longer core to their business, some of which they had acquired and some of which they had developed internally, and they decided to donate it to a university. Now, the university that they donated to decided that they'd be willing to take a donation of this technology, and they'd be willing to let Caterpillar, and for round numbers, let's not pretend that we're going to get all the numbers right here because it really didn't matter in the first place. Let's say they were worth $50 million. And so they donated all the patents to university, and they said, here, university, have these patents. They're worth $50 million. Now, the university, being an academic institution of higher learning and being fully committed to fairness and accountability and everything else, which is what we try to instill in our youth coming up through university, good stuff, instill fairness and accountability, said we'd love to take that $50 million because we need to tell the federal government to get these grants that we're trying to get. We have to tell the federal government that we've gotten institutional and industrial matching contributions to justify our federal grants. And so what we'll do is we'll take this crap that core technology, crap that you want to give us, we'll let you say it was worth $50 million for your tax deduction, and we'll tell the federal government that we got a $50 million contribution from a company, thereby generating a matching grant that justifies getting a federal grant. It's a pretty good racket, isn't it? Now, that wouldn't have happened, obviously. I was just using this as a case study. It couldn't have happened. I was just making that up. It wasn't really Caterpillar, and it wasn't really university, or you know what it was. I'm sorry. It really was them, and it was the university. Yes, that all happened. And $50 million, I'm lowballing. There was a higher number. And the interesting thing about that was that was more cool knowledge economy stuff. If you come up with a bogus number, and you tell somebody that that's what the number is, and then they tell the federal government that, then guess what? You get a tax savings as a company, you get a donation as a university, and the taxpayer gets to pay twice for nothing. That's a good racket. So let's do more. And we do more and more and more. And if you look at their financial statement, the interesting thing is Caterpillar shows you that their intangibles are worth $300 million. They donate $50 million. And their intangibles right after the donation are worth $311 million. Now, I'm really into multidimensionalism. I like multidimensionalism, and I'm sure there's a vector that I can stand in that makes perfect sense when I give away $50 million and I net out 11 positive to me. I haven't found that vector yet. But I'm sure when I find it, I can come back to the Arlington Institute and talk about the vector where you can give away 50 from 300 and net out 311. Now, the cool thing about these case studies is I wish I could make